So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much. Thank you to the In Artibus Foundation. Thank you to the BRAFA for inviting me here tonight. So when Bruno Nelis and Ekaterina Limonad from the BRAFA invited me to Moscow to come to Russia to give you a talk on Pieter Bruegel the Elder, one of my first questions was, why would Russians be so interested in Pieter Bruegel, a Flemish artist who died 450 years ago and whose culture is far removed from their own? What is it about his paintings that appeals to Russians? They said that you love Bruegel and you were particularly passionate about his lovely scenes of winter, his snow scenes. So I'll make sure you see plenty of these here this evening. And I am really happy to share my enthusiasm about Bruegel with you tonight. So this talk, just to let you know, will explore Bruegel's work from a stylistic and technical point of view, providing close-up glimpses into his supreme virtuosity as a painter. But I'll concentrate more on the fascinating phenomenon of the copies of Bruegel the Elder's works, which were reproduced in vast numbers by his elder son, Peter, and to a lesser extent, his younger son, Jan, at the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century. I'll reveal precisely how the sons were able to imitate their father's works with such precision, and even when they couldn't see them with their own eyes sometimes. I'll also touch upon the tricky subject of attribution. In the 17th century, such was the renown of Bruegel the Elder that many anonymous imitators made their living by reproducing his popular scenes or producing pastiches of them. It's already difficult to tell the difference for the untrained eye between Pieter Bruegel the Elder, Pieter Bruegel the Younger, and Jan Bruegel the Elder. But sometimes it takes a forensic approach to distinguish between Pieter Bruegel the Younger's paintings, those of his workshop assistants, those of his contemporaries in the 17th century, and those of the 19th and even 20th centuries. And of course, that's a great problem for the art market. I'll finish this talk with an old favorite, the famous Fall of Icarus by Pieter Bruegel the Elder. But is it really by him? That is the question. So let me just quickly say a few words about myself and my background and where I work. I was originally trained as a painting restorer, but I'm now, I consider myself an art historian, a technical art historian, studying artist techniques and materials, and I work at the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage in Brussels. And this institute is a Belgian federal institution, and our mission is the scientific study and the conservation of works of art of national importance. So at the institute, we have 3 departments. We have our scientific laboratories, which I'll show you here. We have our documentation department, and we take photographs of everything that comes in. As a photographer at work on a drawing by Bruegel the Younger. We also, in part of documentation, we take X-rays of all the paintings and sculptures that come in. And we also have a conservation department. So we have laboratories, wood polychrome sculpture laboratory. We have a stone sculpture studio. We have a textile studio as well. But my favorite, of course, is the painting conservation workshop. And here you see my colleague, Livia Dupert, who's the head of the conservation studio, the painting conservation. And she's restoring the painting you may have seen on the slide that you saw at the beginning, the De Le Gritte by Pieter Bruegel the Elder. And it was recently restored at IRPA it took about a year and a half. And it's just been taken to Vienna to take part in the enormous, wonderful exhibition on Bruegel the Elder that's just opened in October, and it will run till the middle of January. So this, my personal role at the IRPA, we call it the KIK or the IRPA, I run the photography and the scientific imagery unit. And this involves taking photos, X-rays, infrared images of paintings, and various other artworks. And I show here Sophie de Potter, who's my colleague, who's an infrared reflectography technician. And she's standing in front of a version of Pieter Bruegel the Younger's Massacre of the Innocents. And as you will see soon, This sort of examination takes you on a journey inside the paintings themselves, and it lets you see the things that only the artist knew about. And it's art history, I would say, from the painter's perspective. So let's get back to my favorite subject. You all know Pieter Bruegel the Elder, one of the major figures of the Renaissance. He was an original and inspired artist. His works went well beyond the well-trodden ground of Italianism, which was fashionable in the Low Countries at that time. Although he did spend quite a number of years in Italy in his youth, as a very young man, Bruegel chose not to paint the Roman ruins, the beautiful women, the classical gods and goddesses. Instead, he depicted homely Flemish themes, such as landscapes, as you see here, peasant festivities, as in this wonderful wedding feast, and scenes of rural life of the peasants. But he managed to instill in these familiar scenes a sense of universal resonance. And it's this, the portrayal of human activity and human life in all its facets, that still attracts us today. And even now, after 450 years, we can all relate to these paintings in many different ways. They were, and still are, conversation pieces. So if you stand in front of the Flemish Proverbs, which is actually in Berlin and hasn't traveled for the exhibition, so I advise you to go to Berlin. So if you stand in front of this painting, as the original owner and his friends would have done, you can't help but wonder, what are all these small scenes? What are going on in this painting? And you inevitably recognize some of them, to your great surprise and delight. And in my case, I did too, particularly this one here. So my mother always used to say to me, when she wanted to get me to do something that I didn't want to do, she said, "It's like banging my head against a brick wall, Christina." And maybe you have this expression in Russian too, but it's very appropriate sometimes. So, as I would say, with this sort of painting, we can all relate to it, because human follies over time do not change. Stupidity remains, and this doesn't change in different countries and over the centuries. Bruegel did paint, evidently, traditional subject matter, such as religious scenes, but he filled these scenes with interesting, entertaining detail, which makes them pleasurable to look at. In this very tragic scene of the Massacre of the Innocents, rather than concentrating on the poor children being murdered or ripped away from their parents, we in fact look more closely at these dogs playing their game in the background, having fun. Or this rather interesting scene. What has happened is this soldier has decided he needs to relieve himself. He's got off his horse, parked it against a tree, and is doing his business. Very difficult in armor, we think. How is that possible? And in this scene, The Triumph of Death, Bruegel plays on our morbid fascination for horror. These days, some of us like watching horror films. The more gory and bloody, the better. Not my taste, I have to say. But in Bruegel's day, it was no different. And for instance, people loved looking at other people's misfortune in gruesome detail. Executions and scenes of torture, such as this one, were public events, and everybody went to them. So Bruegel puts these in his paintings. There's also a bit of sex here and there, but tastefully added. So if you look carefully at this peasant wedding, and you look in the shadows of the hayloft just above, just here, you may see a couple doing exactly what you think they are doing. There they are. This was inevitably more visible when the painting was first painted, but has gradually become more difficult to see. But we can see it now when we put it in infrared. So Bruegel was no prude, and he strove to entertain and surprise and challenge and sometimes shock us. So today we tend to concentrate so much on the richness of meaning and all these wonderful little details in Bruegel's paintings, we sometimes forget how fascinating and innovative his works are in terms of their technique and style. And that's what interests me personally, given my background as a painting restorer. So here in the Return from the Herd, The Hunters in the Snow, we can appreciate the astonishing mix of vigor, sensitivity, and virtuosity with his brush, the way he handled his brush. Here in the background again, if you look carefully, you can see all these people running around trying to put out a chimney fire. The smallest of detail is understandable when Bruegel painted it. And it's with a marvelous economy of touch as well that he managed to paint this scene. Bruegel's style broke with traditional Flemish techniques of the previous century, with its meticulous finish, so typical of them, where all the brushwork is carefully hidden, carefully blended. Bruegel's pictorial language is more audacious, more spontaneous, and quite inventive. In this, for instance, in this Christ carrying the cross, if you look closely, you can see that he used a blunt point, probably the back end of his brush, to indicate the decoration in this figure's cloth. And if we look a little bit more closely, you can really see how he did it. And I should perhaps mention at this stage that with the opening of the exhibition in Vienna, they've actually introduced a website called, I think it's called Inside Bruegel, and you can zoom in on all the paintings in the collection of Vienna to see these sort of details. Another one, fascinating here, is in the Census at Bethlehem, which is in the Brussels Museum of Fine Arts. Here you can see how Bruegel's used dabs of thick paint to literally represent the weight and the coldness of the snowballs. And in the sky, the blue sky, he paints with an almost impressionistic effect, using his brush dabbed onto the wet paint. Here, in the Sermon of St. John the Baptist, which is in Budapest, in the Museum of Fine Arts, which I went to and spent a week looking at this painting, if you look closely at this figure, and very closely, you can see that instead of a brush, he's used his fingers to dab this glaze, this red glaze on the cloak, and to take off some of the material, to break it up somewhat. I would like to point out at this point, though, that what you see today is not always how it was originally. In this particular case, this red cloak, this white cloak of this gypsy is actually painted with a pigment called smalt, which is a cobalt blue, and originally it would have been an intense blue. And in the copies by Bruegel the Younger, that I'm not going to show you them today, but they're all blue. So it has changed over the centuries. So with Bruegel, I'm just going to go to the next one. We're back to the de la Grite. There was a genuine switch towards a more modern means of pictorial expression. In the de la Grite, shown here, the faces, and I'll show you one here, they're painted in an almost caricatural manner. With just a few brushstrokes, Bruegel captures the essence of his subject, as well as amusing us. Bruegel enjoyed glory and success in his own lifetime. In the decades following his death was in 1569, his paintings and drawings were sought after avidly by a number of collectors. A source tells us, for example, that the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II sent emissaries to Europe to try to acquire more paintings by Bruegel for his collection in his castle in Prague. Many of these paintings are today in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, which you can see obviously on exhibition now. When he died in 1569, Bruegel didn't know that he was to be the father of a great dynasty of painters. He died at the height of his powers at the age of 40. He left behind him 3 very young children. The eldest, Pieter Bruegel the Younger, was just 4 or 5 years old when he died, and then there was Mary, who we don't know anything about, and then there was Jan, the younger son, who was about 2 or maybe 1 year old, very young indeed. So he never knew that he was to have this marvelous dynasty of painters. His sons both went on to be painters. Peter the Younger, here we are, and he made, as we're going to see, faithful copies of his father's works. His younger son, Jan Brueghel the Elder, who became a renowned artist in his own right and often collaborated with other artists such as Rubens. And then we have the son of Pieter Bruegel the Younger, that we know he existed, but we have no signed paintings by his hand. Then you have the sons of Jan Brueghel, including Jan Brueghel the Younger, who continued his father's work in a similar way, painted copies. And then you have 5 more painters. And then the daughters sometimes, they also married artists. So this dynasty goes on down the generations. But it was Pieter Bruegel the Younger, in particular, who claimed his heritage as the legitimate continuator of his father. He produced a multitude of replicas of works by his father. And that is to say, identical copies, as you can see here, of the paintings, and they're so close to the originals that it's very, very hard to tell them apart. And indeed, in this case, the Massacre of the Innocence, the original version was long thought to be a painting that's actually in the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna. It was only on cleaning the version in the Queen's collection in Hampton Court in England that they discovered a signature that was Brueghel's. And then, of course, the experts started to recognize the difference in style. And it's clearly there was only one original version, and that's in the Hampton Court collection. So what's exceptional, indeed unique in the history of art, is this volume of replicas produced by Bruegel the Younger's studio. So with this artist, we're face to face with a phenomenon of artistic mimicry pushed to the extreme, something that had not been seen before and was never seen since. But what's interesting and mysterious are the circumstances of this production. Bruegel the Younger, as you've heard, was only 4 or 5 years old when his father died. So he couldn't have trained with him. And the vast majority of his father's paintings were already in the hands of wealthy private collectors, some of them far away from the Low Countries. So without his father's paintings, and without his father's training, how on earth did he produce such incredible copies? And that was the challenge of my doctoral thesis on Bruegel the Younger, and I'll take you through the evidence of this step by step to reveal the answer. But I should first point out, because I'm always asked this question, did Bruegel the Younger set up his business as a forger or a copyist? Actually, I think everybody knew there were copies, because most of his paintings are signed. In any case, the best of them are usually signed. And when they are signed, they carry inscriptions that are slightly different to those of his father, even though they're both called Pieter Bruegel. And the same goes for Jan. Let's look at the signatures. Pieter Bruegel the Elder's signature was just Bruegel with no P. There we are. Pieter Bruegel the Younger's signature always had a P in front of the word Bruegel. And Pieter Bruegel the Younger also signed with an H after the G. And what's interesting also for Pieter Bruegel the Younger, for people who collect and for me, is that you can tell by the spelling of his name whether his paintings were painted before 1616 or after 1616. And that's because before 1616, he spells his name B-R-U-E-G-H-E-L, as in this one. And after 1616, it's B-R-E-U-G-H-E-L. And that was noticed by one of the greatest art historians on Bruegel the Younger, Klaus Ertz. And it's extremely useful for dating. Jan Bruegel, again, he signs his name with the H, but no J for Jan. But he often dates his paintings, which of course leaves no confusion with paintings by Bruegel the Elder. So I'm going to tackle the copying process through 4 very beautiful compositions. The first being the wedding dance in the open air. In this particular scene, the original version by Bruegel Elder is not known, but it still presents the perfect example for introducing the theme and the question of Pieter Bruegel the Younger's copying practice, as well as that of Jan Bruegel, which is not so familiar. And I'm also going to help introduce you to how we can tell the difference between Jan Brueghel and Pieter Bruegel, the sons, when they copied the same thing. I was able to study 5 examples of this composition, and I'm going to concentrate here. This is the Brussels Museum of Fine Arts version. I examined all of them with infrared reflectography, which enables you to literally see through the paint to the drawing that was painted, the drawing that was made on top of the ground layer. And here, if you go even closer, we can see better the sorts of outlines that Bruegel the Younger or his studio would have made. And these outlines were quite detailed, and they would have guided the painter during painting. We refer to this drawing as the underdrawing for obvious reasons. And in this detail, you can see that the drawing lines are quite lively. They're clearly applied freehand. There's little squiggles here and there for tone, and the fold lines are indicated with lines as well. The drawing material would have been either black chalk or graphite. And why do I know this? I know this because I managed to take samples, very, very small samples, from 6 paintings. And 5 of those proved to be graphite and 1 black chalk. Black chalk was a material that artists use, and we've seen it in many of the beautiful drawings in this exhibition. And it was used from at least the 14th century, whereas graphite was a relatively new material for artists and was first illustrated in a so-called lead pencil, which wasn't lead, it was graphite, in 1565 in Conrad Gessner's Treatise on Fossils. But as you've seen how close these copies were, you must wonder he must have had recourse to some sort of mechanical or semi-mechanical method of copying in view of the vast number of copies that were made. And in the case of the wedding dance, we know of at least 31 identical versions from Bruegel the Younger's studio. And in fact, all in all, Klaus Ertz, who's produced a 2-volume book on Bruegel the Younger's paintings, he illustrates about 2,000 paintings by Bruegel the Younger. So what was possible during this period? You've got the technique of squaring up, which is a very common technique used a lot in Italian painting. We see it in Tintoretto, for example. An artist would have done a preparatory drawing, squared it up, and then on the paint surface itself had larger squares, and then he would copy by eye the design to the final surface, either a canvas, a wall, or a panel. A more accurate method of copying was to use cartoons, and cartoons could either be pricked for pouncing, in this way here, as you see, there's a prick cartoon, or, in fact, transferred by tracing. And for tracing, the design would be on an oiled sheet. There would be a blackened sheet put in between the final surface and the tracing. And then, using a stylus, the artist would press over the lines. And if you want to see afterwards, I've got examples of tracing that I did so that I could understand how these methods work myself, and the pouncing technique as well. You can do your own. A rather unusual technique that I also tried out was the Pantograph. And this was first cited by Christophorus Scheiner in 1631. I tried that. That's usually to transfer a small-scale drawing to a larger one, or a larger one to a smaller one. It works quite well, but it's rather stiff and unnatural, and you can't see really what you're doing. So you can miss bits as you're going along, and the sort of result I had with the Pantograph did not resemble what I was seeing with Bruegel the Younger's underdrawings. So how did I investigate at the beginning? I did tracings myself of all the paintings I examined, tracings of the outlines, and with large format paintings like the one I show here, it's a Massacre of the Innocence. A tracing would take me maybe 6 or 7 hours. It was quite laborious. But because I managed to trace several versions of each kind, I could then compare them, put them one over the other, and see exactly how close they were. And that can helps me know whether, in fact, there's cartoons used or whether it's probably squaring up. So in case of the wedding dance here, I'm going to show you 2 of my tracings overlaid. So I photographed the tracings and then gave one of them a red color and one a black color. And what you see is that the outlines for the figural composition, all the figures, they superpose almost precisely, really precisely. Whereas the background, the trees and then the houses, they don't. So what this tells me is that Bruegel had a cartoon. He must have used a cartoon, he and his studio, to put this wonderful design on the panel as he went along. And then, probably taking the same drawing material, he would fill in the background, which would be slightly different each time, because it wasn't based on a cartoon. So now I'm going to show you another version of the composition. The only painted version is on copper support by Jan Bruegel. Now, Jan Bruegel, we know of two versions of this. One is on paper in the Uffizi Gallery, and I think it's by Jan Bruegel. It looks like it. And then there's this one on copper, which is in the Bordeaux Museum of Fine Arts. And I was lucky enough that this painting traveled to Brussels on exhibition, and I was allowed to examine it in great detail. You probably noticed that, that it's the other way around, but it's not my mistake. Jan Bruegel painted this image in reverse, inversed, if you like, compared to Pieter Bruegel, his brother's versions. I'm not quite sure why he decided, perhaps to make the difference between him and his brother. But we're going to have a look at this copy in comparison with Pieter's. And here we're going to see exactly how different they are in style. So Pieter Bruegel the Younger's style, as you can see here, is very precise, delicate, and even graphic in its approach. He seems to draw with his brush. His paint layers are really thin, and they're often slightly translucent. Whereas Jan Bruegel's version, on the right, we can see it's also very delicate and very precise, but he paints in a more painterly manner. His paint layer is more opaque and rather than translucent, and his brushwork is very finely blended. Let's zoom in a bit. And when you zoom in, you see another difference between the brothers. Jan Bruegel absolutely loved bright ultramarine blues, probably based on lapis lazuli. And this beautiful shot silk coat on this male figure, we never see that in Pieter Bruegel. It's amazing with the sort of red, beautiful red translucent shadows. Oh, going the other way. Their faces also show the same sorts of differences in style. You see Pieter's approach. Now, around the eyes, you see tiny vertical brushwork to emphasize the eye sockets. Jan never uses these. His paint is much more blended and smooth. But in the landscape background, I have to admit, I can't tell the difference between these two artists. They both use the same sort of little brushwork notations and dabs of paint for trees. Sort of shorthand, really, which is not a naturalistic way of painting trees. It's more of a stylized way. And they both use semi-translucent greens and yellows. So now let's compare their underdrawings. This is from one of Pieter's versions, and this one is from Jan's. Jan's version, I should point out, because it's on copper panel, I think the copper itself, the metal, is absorbing slightly the infrared. So you can't see the underdrawing lines so clearly. But if you look at the middle figure at the top, you can see they're slightly more wiry. They're slightly they have slightly more liberty to them than Pieter's. And it's, for me, it's a bit different in terms of handling. When I took a tracing of Jan's version, and of course I had to flip it to make it the same way around as Pieter's, I found out that they correspond very closely indeed for the figures. So what may have happened is that Jan Bruegel, when he came back from Italy, worked in his brother's studio, and he shared the same cartoon and made a version of this painting for himself. But I should point out that Jan Bruegel, although he painted several copies of his father's paintings, he went on to actually become a more creative artist in his own right, painting more mythological scenes, beautiful allegories of taste, allegories of sound, allegories of sight, portraits even. And so he sometimes, in his paintings, he reuses motifs from his father, but he introduces them rather cleverly, he inverts them. He doesn't stick to doing copies. So, you all understand that Pieter Bruegel the Younger used cartoons, but up to this point, you don't know exactly what technique of cartoon he was using, and this is going to be revealed by this new case study, the battle between Carnival and Lent. We'll just look briefly at the original version by Pieter Bruegel the Elder. Now this is a very famous painting in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, painted in 1559. And it shows you all the customs and ceremonies associated with Mardi Gras, or Shrove Tuesday. The jousting figures in the middle, here, personifying Carnival and Lent. So Carnival's the jolly guy on the left with his meat hat, and the thin, rather mean-looking woman on the right is Lent. And all the rituals on the left and the processions are more jovial and contrasted with the actual the figures on the right, and where it's more religious piety, charity, and poverty and sickness. Now we see this pre-Lental carnival today celebrated in Belgium in various festivals, such as in Bâche in Wallonia. And we also see, if you look at this little figure here, we still celebrate some of these traditions today. And this little girl here, or boy, it's difficult to tell what sex. What's happened is, on the 6th of January, Belgian children always celebrate the arrival of the three kings to the newly born Jesus. And we have a galette des rois for that, which is cake of the kings. And it's a rather delicious almond pastry, and hidden inside the cake is what we call a fève, or a sort of charm. And when you have to be very careful when you bite into it, not to break your teeth if you happen to be lucky enough to win the charm. And the one who gets the charm gets a paper crown, which they become king for the day. So this child here, this is the charm here, has been crowned king. And what's funny is that this is my son, who was crowned king 450 years later, 2016. So, Bruegel the Younger, for this painting, he made at least 5 copies. Rather sadly, the one in black and white is in black and white because it was destroyed during the Second World War. It was in Cracovie. But we're going to concentrate on the version in the Brussels Museum of Fine Arts. Here. And this painting was particularly useful for me. It was actually bought by the Museum of Fine Arts in 2001. And I was at the sale, and it was while I was doing my PhD. And I was delighted that the museum managed to raise the funds to buy it. And after they'd done so, and the auctioneer said, right, this is going to the Museum of Fine Arts, everybody cheered and said, vive la Belgique and everything. And then the director came down the aisle, and she said, Christina, this one's for you. And I was like, wow. So and it turned out to be more interesting than I imagined, because it was the Rosetta Stone, my Rosetta Stone, to understanding Bruegel the Younger's copying technique. But I'll let you look at it first a little bit. This is some of the poor beggars with blind eyes. And behind the surface, you see Bruegel the Younger's usual drawing, very, very detailed. Another wonderful detail of a woman carrying her baby in her basket. Behind also the underdrawing, very clear, very detailed. Here, this funny figure with a felt cap and a spoon, masked. And behind you see a very lively drawing with little hatchings for tone. And here the famous figure of Carnival with this meat pie on his head. Looks like there might be something coming out of it. And behind with the underdrawing. But the figure that really helped me is this one. and you've probably seen it. Around all the outlines, you can see tiny dots. And of course, that gives them the game away. He used a pounced cartoon to transfer his image from a cartoon to panel. So these are the dots, these are the outlines. So for this method, what we would have had is a cartoon, and I've used, in fact, the infrared image, pricked to size, and I pricked through all the actual dots that I saw. So this is how the cartoon would have looked. Ooh. Then the artist would have placed his cartoon on the panel surface and pounced through with a black or a red pigment to the surface. And then he would have joined up the dots with black chalk or graphite. So in this detail, it's kind of curious. You see these black dots. Yeah, there we are. Oh, let's go back again. But you see they're slightly smudged. So I imagine he put his cartoon on, he pounced, and then he sort of moved his cartoon slightly. So we're seeing this mistake 450 years later. But interestingly enough, if you look at Lent, there are no dots. And I think this is the normal thing. And I think the fact that we saw the dots in some of the figures was because the artist probably painted on a surface such as the imprimatura, which was the final layer, before he, and it was still tacky when he applied his cartoon. So this black powder would have stuck in the paint. I should point out, this is another one of the only copies by Jan Brueghel, the elder of the Sermon of St. John the Baptist. He did one large format version, which is in Basel, the Kunstmuseum in Basel, and the other one is in Munich. It's a much smaller one. But if you look carefully, you can see the pouncing dots. I put them in red so it's easier to see. So he has used pouncing to transfer this image. And I managed to study 4 versions by Pieter Bruegel, the younger, of this as well. And I traced them all, and I traced this large one from Jan. And both brothers clearly used the same cartoons. All the figures match perfectly. But in Pieter Bruegel, the younger's version, there are no traces left of pouncing dots. But because of this evidence in Jan Bruegel, and because of the cartoons matching perfectly, I can say they both shared the same cartoons. And this is one example of when I think Jan was probably working in his brother's workshop after getting back from Italy. So let me just take you through how Bruegel the younger would have painted. It's much the same technique as Bruegel the elder, I should point out, and Flemish painting in general. He would take a good quality oak plank. He would size it, probably with animal glue, rabbit skin glue, which would have sealed the pores. He would then apply a chalk ground. In the south, in Italy, it's more gypsum. In the north, in Belgium, it's in the Low Countries, because it wasn't Belgium in those days. It would be chalk mixed with rabbit skin glue, and then it would be applied in several layers. The layers were allowed to dry, and between layers, it would be rubbed down with probably a local plant, such as horsetail. Horsetail was applied, it grows by rivers, and it's got silica in the stems. So it's a very efficient abrasive. And then on top of the ground, it was slightly porous because it was chalk and glue, the artist would have applied what we call an imprimatura, which was oil-based, and in Bruegel the elder's case, in fact, it was usually white. In Bruegel the younger's, it was slightly tinted beige or grey, so with ochre pigments or black pigments. Then, of course, he would use his cartoon to pounce the design. And this I show a colleague of mine who was unfortunately died, but he helped me do all these reconstructions. This is Bob Gase, and he pounced through. I've actually got the equipment there, so you can try it yourselves afterwards. And then, of course, using black chalk mounted onto a porte-mine, he would apply the underdrawing. Afterwards, of course, these black dots would have been rubbed away, either with a pigeon wing or a rag. And this shows you the whole process in one panel. So, incidentally, although no cartoons survive for Pieter Bruegel, the younger studio, and none from Pieter Bruegel, the elders, several prick cartoons by Italian masters do survive, such as this one by Leonardo da Vinci in the National Gallery, which is a large drawing made of lots of pieces of paper stuck together. And of course, this one by Raphael. Raphael used the pouncing technique to transfer his drawings to other drawings and then to paintings. And in this one on the left, you can see the pouncing material is probably red chalk. You can see it smudged slightly around the lines. But it wasn't, I mean, although Pieter Bruegel, the younger, and I have to just mention something. We think that Pieter Bruegel, the elder, probably also used this technique in some of his compositions, but not all. And his master, Peter Cook, who you see here, also used the pouncing technique to transfer painting. So this is for use in tapestries. So it was a well-known technique at the period. Now we're going to look at another familiar snow scene, which is the Censors at Bethlehem. So this beautiful composition, it shows the biblical episode of the Census at Bethlehem, which was ordered by Emperor Augustus. You can see Mary and Joseph here in the foreground, making their way across the snowy landscape to the tavern at the left, where they are registering themselves and paying their taxes. And Bruegel also alludes to the Spanish occupation of the Netherlands and the very despised practice of tax collecting during his own period. So I was lucky enough to be able to study this painting in great detail as it is in the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Belgium, and along with 7 of the copies. They're all rather big, these copies, and they're about 1.70 meters wide. So let's look at them and compare them with the original version. First of all, let's notice the difference in color and motif. So if you can see here at the top, you can see that in Bruegel the Elder's painting, there is a very beautiful red setting sun. And this setting sun sets the mood and sets the atmosphere of the whole painting. But in the copies, the sun is either missing, as in this copy, or painted yellow, as if the sun didn't realize what time of day it was in the original painting. And there's also this curious thing here. The skater, which is a really iconic figure in Bruegel the Elder's painting, and it's missing in the copies, and there's a strange gap in the composition. And if you look as well, there's a hole in the ice in the original, which is completely missing in the copies. He's interpreted it as a sort of snowy mound. And he's also, Bruegel the Younger's copies don't have this wonderful bird making its way across the barrel. There's lots of other motifs like this. If you look at this barrel here, leaning against the barrel in the original version is a kind of circle thing, which is probably a ring that was used to hold the barrel together. And in the son's copies, he's interpreted it as a sack, a sort of sack. And then we have the dogs. In the original version, you have a rather nice black dog, which I would interpret as a retriever, in comparison to my mother's retriever, Dragon. Sadly died, but rather nice photograph. And in the copies, this is certainly not a retriever. I would say it's probably more like a spaniel, like this one. And all the copies are like this. So you might wonder, what does this mean? Why are there all these differences? And so that does suggest, in fact, that the copies, Bruegel the Younger did not base his copies on the painting itself, but that he based them on drawings. And that is probably the secret of his copying practice, that he inherited from his father drawings in order to make his copies, as well as cartoons in some cases. let's show you a bit more. So in the case of the census, I managed to trace 6 versions. And what I found out was that they match up, but not as a whole. They match up in parts. So here on these 2, it matches up in the lower right corner. And when I shifted the tracing several times, I found there was various groups that match up very closely. And then I put my tracings on the original version by Bruegel the Elder, and I found out that these same groups fit quite closely with the original. So what I think is that Bruegel the Younger was using not a whole cartoon of the whole painting, but separate cartoons, small ones, for different parts. So what he must have had when he painted was a model drawing, or a modello, of the whole composition. He had to know where to put all his cartoons. And then he would have inherited small, different, probably pricked cartoons from his father. And this also tells us about Bruegel the Elder's practice in composing his paintings. He didn't just start painting, change his mind. He planned it very carefully as well. And he left behind all his very, very interesting and detailed preparatory work for his son. And we should, as you know, the son couldn't have inherited directly because he was only 4 or 5, but Bruegel the Younger's grandmother, Maiken Verhulst, was an artist in her own right. She must have kept this material very carefully and passed it on to the elder son, Pieter, who then used it to make his entire career. So this is another interesting related subject, style and attribution. This is rather tricky. And you might ask, apart from the obvious differences I've shown you in motif and color, is there a real difference in style between Pieter Bruegel the Elder's paintings and Pieter Bruegel the Younger's paintings? And in my opinion, there is. And the difference is exaggerated when Pieter Bruegel the Younger clearly didn't see the paintings by his father. In the case of the battle between Carnival and Lent that I showed you earlier, his copies are, in fact, stylistically even harder to tell the difference between his and his father, because I believe in those cases he saw the original painting. The colors are the same, the motifs are the same. There are no such differences that I've showed you here. However, in the census at Bethlehem, when he didn't see the original, we can really see their own styles starting to show. So Pieter Bruegel the Elder, this is a detail from the background. Pieter Bruegel the Elder preferred slightly more subdued colors in certain areas of his painting. And here you can see also more clearly what's happening. The little kid is warming his hands in front of the fire, and it's more a natural way of painting. The figures are getting on with their stuff. You can really understand what's going on, whereas in the copies, it's a bit more anecdotal. They're kind of jolly. You don't quite know what's going on in the same way. The brushwork is completely different as well. Here again, this is a nice example of the snowballers. So in Bruegel the Elder's version, you can see really that this one on the left, he's running along and he's trying to sort of get the one on the right with his snowball. And the one on the right, he's already got a snowball on his shoulder. So he's trying to pick up his stock of snowballs and escape before he's been got. Whereas in Bruegel the Younger's version, this is one of many, many versions, the figure throwing the snowballs is kind of not looking where he's going, he's looking at the sky. The one on the right is unlikely to actually get a snowball on his head at all. So here are the 14 known copies by Bruegel the Younger that exist. And when I first, in fact, they keep coming to the surface. When I did my PhD and when I published, in fact, my book, there were only 13 copies. And then a year or so ago, I had a phone call from London dealer, Johnny Van Haften, and he said, I've got another one, and I want you to look at it. And it was being restored in London at the time. And so I went over. It was from a private collection in Africa. So I went to London to look at it and said, yes, I think it's marvelous. It's a great copy. And it's one of the few copies on canvas. So it was a new discovery, if you like. It had lain hidden in this African collection for about 50 years, and nobody knew about it. And what was interesting for me is that Johnny Van Haften, I said I would just love to examine it, if possible. He said, okay. So he sold it at the Fries Fair, and he made it a point at the sale for the new owner to bring it to Brussels so I could examine it, which I did do. And I will publish it one day, but I haven't yet, but it's a wonderful painting. So you might say, we've got 14 known copies. Did Bruegel the Younger do them all himself? Well, obviously not. It's too much. And in fact, we know that he had help. We know that for a fact, because there are registers from the Guild of St. Luke in Antwerp, and they register Bruegel the Younger, and they register the assistants that he had. And every 3 or 4 years, there are 2 or 3 new assistants that come into his studio. So altogether, there were about 9, and some of these would have stayed with him for their careers. When you weren't son of a master, it was very expensive to set up as an artist. So some of these people would have stayed with him. And then he would also perhaps have had journeymen who would come and work for him for maybe 1 year or 2 years. But we don't know much more than that. As I mentioned before, quite a number of Bruegel the Younger's paintings are signed. And most of the paintings that are signed are very good indeed. And I would reckon that most of them are by his hand, having looked at them. But not always. And I'd just like to show you this pair here. So the one on the left is dated 1610, is in the Museum of Fine Arts in Brussels. And the one on the right was actually, I examined it at De Jonker Gallery in Brussels. It's now in a private collection. So let's first of all look underneath the surface at the drawing. The snowballers, a lovely motif. So the one on the left, I think you'll agree, is much more vivacious, more spontaneous. It looks like the artist really had confidence when he was drawing these 2 figures. Whereas the one on the right, in my opinion, is more scholarly. He's really copying the lines and presumably the pouncing dots very carefully. The same goes for the rooftops. So when the one on the left is drawing his lines, he's not too concerned. He doubles back a little bit on his line. And the gables of the house are done a little bit more loosely. Whereas the one on the right is one single line. It's very studious, and he's copying it very carefully. Let's look at these hens at the front. So the one on the left, you can see that the artist is really relaxed. He's decided to change the position of this head of the one on the left slightly during drawing, whereas the one on the right sticks to the design more closely. And then you look at this little figure here. The one on the left is slightly more naturalistic. This is one of my favorite figures. He's either a dwarf or a little child. We're not quite sure. They both have the same kind of drawing technique, and they both show hair with little teeny vertical strokes, which is very typical. Trees were also drawn like this in Bruegel's paintings. The one on the right, I would reckon, is slightly more caricatural, not so naturalistic. But when we look at the paint layer, the same differences apply. Although I should point out that the one in Brussels is in not such good condition as the one in the private collection, which is why the colors are not so fresh. And that is a problem with all my examinations, is that a painting in beautiful, wonderful condition by a sort of lesser hand will appear to our eyes much nicer than a painting perhaps by a better artist in bad condition. We just have to try and distinguish the difference. So in this motif, I think you can see that on the left, the figures move together slightly, and they move towards each other more, well, towards the left of the painting, more naturally. And the ones on the right are more stiff. And I think the ones on the right, the figure on the very right looks like his head has been squashed down on his shoulders. His face is kind of missing, almost. This is an interesting comparison. The child in the 1610 version is clearly begging for money, whereas the child on the right, it's not even clear he's a child. His hand is not positioned in the right way, and the artist clearly didn't know what he was supposed to paint. He just painted a figure. Here as well, you've got, on the left, you've got some sort of relationship between these two figures. The one in the brown coat is kind of looking towards us. He's talking, but he's looking, he's keeping his eye on things. And the one on the right is a nice, banal, a happy character with no personality. The architectural elements also, I believe, are slightly better painted in the one on the left than the one on the right, and better understood. He understood the curve of this wall better. So you might wonder whether they're done by different artists, and I think they were. And I've actually, I think the same artist did the underdrawing and the paint in both cases, because the stylistic differences apply both to the underdrawing and the painting. And I found that in all the paintings I've examined, that the underdrawing style, if it's slightly different, is also slightly different in the paint layer. But this version, when I was looking, I'd actually finished my examination, I suddenly noticed this on the door, which is, it looks like sort of backwards writing. And so I thought, well, we better look at it with a mirror. And when you turn it round, you've got the words van kan, which in Dutch means the potter, the potter, the person who makes ceramics. So it could well be a name of somebody. So either it was the name of this mysterious assistant, who's unidentified, who decided to sign it secretly, or maybe some restorer who's done it and hidden it. I don't know. It's a mystery, and it will remain a mystery. But the question of the signature with Brueghel's paintings, therefore, is interesting, because it proves that when he signed a painting, it was the mark of a good production of his studio, and not necessarily his own hand. And the same goes, sometimes unsigned paintings are of the top quality, and so we can't be absolutely sure when you get a signature whether it's his hand or not, and where there's no signature whether it's hand or not. But what I can say with all my studies, and we're looking at cartoons, I can say whether a painting is from the studio or outside the studio. Now, let's look at another case, which is the wonderful winter scene with bird trap, which is one of the iconic scenes of winter. You'll have all seen it before, maybe on chocolate boxes from Belgium, because it's so well known. You might ask, because there's over 50 versions of this painting by Brueghel the Younger, you might ask, how on earth do we know that this one is Brueghel the Elder? Because it does look very like all the copies. It's got quite a yellow varnish on it now. It wouldn't have been so yellow originally. Luckily for me, this painting is in the Museum of Fine Arts in Brussels, so I was able to study it in great detail. So there's various evidence that we can use to establish that this painting is a copy. And some are technical, some evidence is technical, and some is obviously stylistic. The painting here, the original version, I have to say it is, I'm sure it is signed and dated. So these are the copies I've done, studied. When you've got a version in the Pushkin Museum as well, which is a wonderful, actually, version by Brueghel the Younger. Go back to the original. The signature is in the corner, the lower right corner. You can see it on the left, in normal light. In normal light, you can read Brueghel, and then you can read 1565. It's written in a lead white paint. And because it's written in lead white paint, in the X-ray, which is on the right, a detail, you can see it. But you might see as well that it looks like it's got another signature underneath on the right. And in fact, when I study it, I traced it, it's the same signature, in fact. And I don't think it's suspect. I think what happened in this case was that Brueghel, he finished this corner without this twisty tree. He then decided to keep painting. So he had to sign his painting again. So that's what happened. I think it was that he finished it, thought it was finished, then carried on a bit. This tree acts as a kind of repoussoir motif to kind of lead you into the painting and concentrate your focus on the scene. So there we are. So another type of evidence I have that this is the original version comes from the wooden support, which is made of oak. My colleague, Pascal Freiture, who you can see here, is an expert in dendrochronology. And this is the study of tree rings. And what she does is she measures the distance between the annual rings, and then she compares these measurements with known samples which have been dated. She needs about 100 rings to make a dating. And these rings, in fact, they vary in width according to how wet the summer is. So in the case of the winter landscape with bird trap, she found out that there was actually a sapwood ring, and normally the artist, the panel maker, would remove all this sapwood. But if there is sapwood, it helps for dating. And she found that this sapwood ring dates from 1551, which makes it perfectly possible that the painting is by Bruegel the Elder. Doesn't mean it's not by Bruegel the Younger, however, because he could have used an old plank, that's true. But we have one more thing that's very interesting. There are two other paintings by Bruegel the Elder of exactly the same format in English collections. The one in the middle is dated 1563. It's in the Courtauld collection. And the one on the right, it's The Death of the Virgin. It's in the Upton House National Trust collection near Banbury. And it's not dated, but we think it's around 1565. Now, Pascal Freiture has contacts in Britain, and there's not many people doing dendrochronology. So she and Ian Tyers, who's the English sort of specialist, compared their dendrochronology notes on their paintings. Ian Tyers did the two ones in England, she did the one in Belgium. And they found out by comparing their spectra that these three paintings are painted on planks from the same tree. So it really helps in the attribution of the winter scene with bird trap to know that the same tree was used for these three paintings. It's more likely to be Bruegel than anybody else. But we have more evidence. We have the evidence of the underdrawing. And I think you agree on looking at this that the underdrawing is nothing like anything I've shown you from Pieter Bruegel the Younger. And I will show you later a bird trap with an underdrawing, and you'll be able to see it more clearly. What I've shown you with the yellow arrows here are how he changed his mind slightly on the positioning of these gabled windows. And that you can see there that the drawing, it's difficult to distinguish from the paint now, I'll give you that. But it's more sketchy than Bruegel the Younger would have done. More like an artist who was creating something. But there's more than that. When you look at the bird trap, and this bird trap is really the motif that defines the meaning for for generations of art historians. But it turns out that Bruegel the Elder may not even have intended it to be present, at least not in this particular spot. Because when we look in the underdrawing with infrared reflectography, it's not underdrawn. All we can see in infrared, in fact, is the paint layer. Bruegel the Younger, this is one painting by him. You look underneath. The underdrawing is very precise for the bird trap. When you look at the X-ray of the original, you can see my point is proven by the fact that the artist has not reserved a space for the bird trap. He has reserved a space for the tree, which is on a dark patch in the X-ray. Because artists in those days, in fact, from the 15th century, they didn't just paint a background and then paint on top. They did their drawing, they painted the background, leaving spaces for the motifs still to come. And what that meant is that there was no, the paint there didn't get too thick, it didn't crack. It was it was a good way of painting. And in this case, he changed his mind late, and the bird trap is painted directly on the snow. Whereas Bruegel the Younger, here, has left a gap in his snow paint for the bird trap. He knew it was going to be coming. But I should point out that it's possible that Bruegel the Elder did intend to put a bird trap somewhere, because if you look in infrared, there are lines down here, and then if you look at X-ray, there's something here as well that seems to have been started. And then he changed his mind, and this may explain as well the fact the signature was twice written. He changed his mind and painted a tree in that spot, as you can see. So this could be the bird trap, these strange lines, or it could be some contraption to hold up snow or something. But it does show that the painting has evolved during painting. and it therefore is the original version. The final evidence, of course, is just by looking. Pieter Bruegel the Elder has a more painterly approach to painting, less graphic. Pieter Bruegel the Younger's version, although it's a very beautiful technique, is totally different, more graphic. He really draws with his brush differently from his father. So we can now tell the difference between Bruegel the Elder, between Bruegel the Younger. But what happens when you have a painting that's painted perhaps outside the studio by another artist or unknown figure? This painting came to me for examination, for attribution, I should say, from a private Brussels collection, on panel. Reverse side is cradled, which is a very common technique in the 19th century and sometimes the 20th century, which is not good for panels. So if ever anybody suggests to do that to your paintings, don't let them, because they crack. Let's go through. So this painting is a very close copy, as you can see. At first sight, you might think Bruegel workshop. But there's one interesting detail that's different, and I'm zooming in on the Bruegel the Elder version here, just so you'll have the comparison. Oh. And here I show you at the top a copy by Bruegel the Younger, which is in the Antwerp Museum, Meyer van den Berg Museum, signed and dated 1622. The bottom is the one that interests us. When you zoom in, you can see that there are additional figures on the bridge in the Bruegel the Younger version that you don't see in the original version. And this is the case, there's also, and you do see them on the version, the Brussels Private Collection version. There are also Mary and Joseph motif in this version, which is not in the original. And I should point out that Bruegel the Younger produced about 5 of these types out of his 50 with this Mary and Joseph and with the figures on the bridge. And these paintings are usually dated around 1622. So this one down below, we can say, well, is it another atypical version from Bruegel the Younger studio, or is it a copy of a painting from Bruegel the Younger? It can't obviously be copied after Bruegel the Elder because those figures are not there. I traced it, as usual. The tracing fits perfectly. So far so good. The cartoon could be the same. I then looked at it in infrared reflectography, and there the difference starts to appear quite clearly. And I'll have to zoom in so you see. This is the painting in the Meyer van den Berg by Bruegel the Younger, signed and dated. You can see the drawing on the horizon, probably the town of Antwerp. You can see it's been outlined in great detail. You can also see the underdrawing for the houses quite clearly. The trees, it's more tricky to see because the paint, he's outlined his trees in black paint, and that absorbs infrared in the same way as the drawing. And the figures, likewise, they're absorbing infrared. But the trees and the houses, they're what you should look at. And also all the little, another typical thing with Bruegel, as I mentioned, trees have little lines, little vertical lines to indicate the foliage of the trees. That's a typical notation of Bruegel the Younger. The copy, the one we saw from the unknown, the collection in Brussels, what you mostly see in this infrared image is cracks. You see the crack pattern very clearly. You see the tree, you barely see the houses, and you don't see the Antwerp on the horizon. And what you are seeing, in fact, is the paint layer absorbing infrared. For those of you who don't know how infrared reflectography works, in fact, it's any black carbon-containing material and some greens will absorb infrared strongly and therefore appear black on the screen, and most other colors become either transparent or translucent, which allows us to see drawing when it's carbon-based, like graphite and black chalk. So you might ask, well, how did he manage, this artist, how did he manage to draw so precisely? So I looked at the painting with a microscope, and I saw that, in fact, he has done an underdrawing, but it's in red chalk. And red chalk's made of iron oxide pigments, which is completely transparent to infrared, which is why I can't see it in infrared reflectography. You can only see this underdrawing when it goes slightly beyond the paint layer. Here, you have to look very carefully. It's difficult to see. But then, colleagues of mine, we said, well, okay, it's not Bruegel the Younger studio, it's not his technique, but is it contemporary? Is it 17th century? And I have to say, some of the restorers in the painting studio at the KIK-IRPA said, oh yeah, it's a nice copy, most likely original, nice wood panel. So I gave it to Stephen Savaroens, who's in our laboratories, for X-ray fluorescence analysis. What I'd noticed previously was another strange anomaly, is that the ground layer, which you see here, and you see here through the cracks, yeah, there, the ground layer is, in fact, beige in color. Bruegel always painted with white. But with X-ray fluorescence analysis, it analyzes the elements making up the pigments. And in this case, what he found was zinc. And the only pigment that comes from zinc is zinc white. And it was zinc in large quantities. It wasn't just some sort of small element you might get in a ground that's just by mistake there. No, it was in huge quantities, which means it was zinc white. And zinc white was a pigment that was introduced in the middle of the 19th century. So we do know that, and it was actually replacing lead white, which is a more toxic white pigment. So we know that this painting dates from the 1840s at the earliest. So it could date from the early 20th century. The crack pattern is quite convincing, so it probably is the early 20th century or late 19th century. So I'm now going to move on to the final point I have, which is the Fall of Icarus. Let's go find my notes. This is an interesting painting. I just should introduce Mike. This is Dominique Allard, who Katja mentioned earlier. She was the lady who supervised my PhD thesis on Bruegel the Younger, and her expertise is Bruegel the Elder. So we teamed up together, and we wrote a book together here, which is, oh no, not here. No, I haven't got it here, which I'll show you later. In this book, we wrote about the Fall of Icarus. In fact, the Fall of Icarus, when we hear about the Fall of Icarus, you think of the version in the Museum of Fine Arts in Brussels. Whereas, in fact, there are two versions. There's one in Brussels, and there's one in the Uccle Van Buren collection. And there's been, all through the 20th century, there's been a controversy as to which of these two paintings are the original painting by Bruegel the Elder. The one on the left for the Museum of Fine Arts was purchased in 1912 as a copy of a lost work by Bruegel the Elder. And the one on the right was purchased in the 50s, and the owner thought it was Bruegel the Elder, in fact. And there's been a debate ever since. Sometimes art historians say yes, sometimes they say no. So we decided to examine them in great detail, and my colleagues at the KIK examined them previously to me. What they did previously to my study was examine the one on the right with dendrochronology. The one on the right is on panel, one on the left is on canvas. So, as you know, with dendrochronology, you can find out, basically you can date the last tree ring and what date that was. And in fact, what we found out was the tree from which the panel was taken was still growing in the forest when Pieter Bruegel the Elder died. So that one's out. The other hand, the Royal Museum of Fine Arts version is on canvas, which makes it rather more difficult. So what they did at the KIK is they did at my institution, they examined it by radiocarbon dating. Radiocarbon dating gives probabilities. It doesn't give a precise date. So what they found was that the greatest probable date for this canvas was between 1555 and 1635. But the greatest possibility was between 1582 and 1625, and Bruegel died in 1569. But let's consider the paint layer, because that leaves a tiny possibility, that dating. when you look at the man here, the farmer, pushing his plough, he is painted rather stiffly, and he does not recall in any way the sort of paintings that we find, the sort of images and the sort of figures we find in Bruegel the Elder's paintings, which have so much more movement, so much more lightness of touch. People have said, oh, it's because the Fall of Icarus is so abraded, so damaged. Maybe, but this doesn't explain the stiffness, and especially in details which are in good condition, like, for instance, these rocks, these cliffs in the background. If you compare them with cliffs in Bruegel's paintings, like The Return of the Herd, there is a world of difference in their quality and their brushwork. And then, when you look at the underdrawing, which we did, which was a kind of new study, and you zoom in a bit more, you can see that it's done in a very hesitant, kind of scholarly manner, no digressions, and it doesn't relate any way to the sort of underdrawings that we've seen, and I've seen in Bruegel the Elder. And if you look now on the website of the Kunsthistorische Museum paintings, and you look at those underdrawings, you will see they have no relation to this very poorly executed underdrawing. So that leaves us with 2 copies of a lost work by Bruegel the Elder. How do we know it's a lost work? In fact, we know that Bruegel the Elder did do a Fall of Icarus, because apparently there was one in Rudolf II's collection in Prague. There's a mention of it in 1621. But they're very important copies, because they're witness to this marvelous composition that Bruegel created. And so, if any of you find it one day, please let me know. And thank you for your attention. Thank you. Yeah. So, yeah, that's the, I should just mention, that is the book I published on Bruegel, which, which gives you a lot of the material you've seen tonight, plus a lot more. And if anybody would like a copy, there's some brochures here you can take, which gives a special reduction. Did anybody like any questions? Yeah? Or, yeah?
Добрый вечер, меня зовут Чайкина Юлия. Я начальник отдела экспертизы, научно-исследовательской независимой экспертизы имени Павла Михайловича Третьякова. И мне очень понравился ваш доклад, и в процессе того, что вы рассказывали, мне очень интересно стало. Скажите, пожалуйста, а вот метод рентгенографирования, вот он помогает отличить Питера Брейгеля-старшего от Питера Брейгеля-младшего и последующих копиистов? Спасибо.
Yes. What I found out from the X-rays of all the Pieter Bruegel the Younger's copies is that when he reserved areas, they're all reserved in exactly the same places, whereas the original versions are not necessarily reserved. And that's the case with the census at Bethlehem. I showed you one example, which was the winter scene with bird trap, but it is the case with the census at Bethlehem. So Bruegel the Elder wasn't using the same techniques necessarily as his son. I mean, he painted, then he'd change his mind sometimes, but with the copies, the reserves are identical. It's possible that paintings that are not Bruegel the Younger have a different technique, and sometimes I haven't, that copy, I didn't show an X-ray, but I can't remember whether it's reserved in the same places, but I have an X-ray of it.
Большое спасибо за информацию, которую вы предоставили. Меня зовут Сергей, у меня 2 вопроса. Первый вопрос. Ставите ли вы себе целью и задачу определить непосредственно руку Питера Брейгеля-младшего среди всей группы товарищей, о которых вы говорили? И второй вопрос. Мне попадается иногда информация у Клауса Эрца и Макса Фриландера о том, что некоторые копии, повторы этих работ, в частности «Бобовый король», насколько я помню, делал Мартин ван Клеве. Но Мартин ван Клеве жил одновременно с Питером Брейгелем-старшим и ненамного его пережил там. Каким образом Мартин ван Клеве имел доступ к этим картонам и фрагментам?
Yeah, the first question about the attribution. Yes, in my book, I do make a core group, what I consider works by Bruegel the Younger, his hand, and then I have works outside that core group, still from his workshop. Some I don't know. Some, especially the winter scene with bird trap, the underdrawings and the paint there are so similar, it's impossible to say it's one hand or another. It's usually on the large format paintings that the artists or the different workshop members sort of reveal themselves with their style. They can't help it. So I have this core group, and I make a list. But of course, I didn't study the 2,000 paintings. I studied about, for the book, it was about 60. I've now looked at more, probably 100 more altogether. Now, the second question again. Can you repeat a little bit? Oh, yeah, Martin van Clever. Yes. I don't think he did. And Martin van Clever's, I think when Martin van Clever copied Bruegel, it was because the original was still visible, and his interpretations are sometimes slightly different from those of Bruegel the Younger. Bruegel the Younger, on the other hand, as you know, also copied Martin van Clever's pastiches of Bruegel the Elder. You've got Massacre of the Innocence, which I showed you, the large format version. Then you've got Martin van Clever, who must have seen that and produced his own Massacre of the Innocence, which is slightly smaller. And then Pieter Bruegel the Younger, who copied Martin van Clever as well. So Pieter the Younger copies van Clever sometimes, and also his father. So he's copying the pastiche of his father sometimes, which is interesting. But I don't think Van Clever had access to any cartoons. There were no precise copies by Van Clever. He did his own thing. He interpreted Bruegel the Elder in his own way.
Есть еще какие-то вопросы?
Maybe I can just mention one more thing. Hang on. Look, do any of you, are you all interested in Jan van Eyck? Because if you look on this website here, you can see all our images that are taken recently of the Ghent altarpiece. And not just the Ghent altarpiece, this shows one of the panels. And right now our institution is restoring it in Ghent. You can see it, it's behind glass in the Museum of Fine Arts. It's been restored in 3 phases, and we're now at the end, coming towards the end of the second phase. But we're also documenting the process in great detail in X-ray, infrared, and normal light. And you can go on this website and zoom in on the Ghent altarpiece. It's marvelous. And also, in accessory to that project, I and my team have gone all around Europe photographing paintings by Van Eyck, and we put them on the same website. So you can click on Van Eyck, the Ghent altarpiece, or other paintings, and you can see them all with the underdrawings, the X-rays, and macro photography in enormous detail. And you can use these images in your PowerPoints, in your publications. If you want to publish them, you just let us know. You can take print screens, they're such marvelous images, but if you want the actual images, let us know, and the museum, and we'll send you to them, the parts you want for publication.